Hi, good evening, good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you here. I'm Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and on behalf of Jews United for Democracy and Justice and Community Advocates, Inc., I warmly welcome you to tonight's America at a Crossroads virtual town hall program. Our judge leadership team is former Congressman Mel Levine, David Lehrer, former LA County Supervisor Zev Yaroslavsky, Caroline Kelly, and Rabbi Ken Chazin. And a minute ago, you saw the list of co-sponsors on the screen. A special welcome tonight to our C-SPAN audience, which is tuning in tonight. We are excited tonight to learn about America's youngest voters from experts in both millennial and post-millennial political generational trends, as well as efforts to suppress the votes of the young. We welcome Yael Bromberg, Michael Hais, who will be in conversation with Morley Winograd. More about them in a minute. Next week on December 29th, there is no program, but on January 25th, we have invited a very special set of guests who will help us evaluate the country's condition as we mark the first anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. Joanna Mendelson from ADL Center on Extremism, Imran Ahmed from the Center for Digital Hate, and Carol Leonig from the Washington Post will discuss 1 year later, our capital, our country, our democracy, where are we, with Larry Mantle as our moderator. And on January 12th, we're excited to welcome back Roberta Kaplan, lead counsel in the Charlottesville case, in which she prevailed with a huge judgment against the Nazi defendants. Roberta will appear with her co-counsel, Karen Dunn, and Integrity First for America's executive director, Amy Spitalnik, in conversation with UC Irvine law professor Henry Weinstein. The topic, defeating Nazis in court inside the Charlottesville trial. As we prepare to close out another year of digital programming, we want to thank you, our audience. Thanks for the donations and especially for the appreciative notes. It warms our hearts, and because we're all volunteers, we really appreciate that. It's great compensation. Full unedited recordings of all of our programs can be found on our YouTube channel and on our website, and an easy-to-use link is in every email which David or I send, including the one right after this program, so you can pass it around to your friends and colleagues. To all members of our audience who celebrate Christmas, we want to wish you a wonderful, healthy holiday, and to everyone, we offer our very best wishes for a happy and healthy new year. Let's hope for the best as we move into this really important year in the field that we are all concerned about in this series, and that's 2022 is going to be a big year. Now, please welcome my amazing partner, David Lehrer, who's going to tell you about a couple more programs and begin to introduce our panel. David?
Thank you, Janice. And just one correction, Janet misspoke. Our program on the January 6th insurrection will be on January 5th, not the 25th. It'll be January 5th, one day before the anniversary. And I'd like to let everyone know about a new program that we have for January 19th, 4 weeks from tonight. Given the recent saber rattling by the Kremlin, it's especially timely that we focus on Russian relations with a trio of experts that have unmatched insights. Washington Post columnist Max Boot, one of our most frequent and asked for guests, will be joined by Garry Kasparov, former world chess champion, leading Russian dissident, and the chair of the Renewed Democracy Initiative. We have another important foreign policy figure that we're lining up, have not yet locked down. You can't yet register for that program. We'll let you know when our final panelist is firm and the program is available for signing up. That again will take place on the 19th of January. Later next month, we will host Anne Applebaum, the Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist of The Atlantic, whose analyses of current events and what they mean are invaluable and widely quoted. Our host tonight is Morley Winograd, a senior fellow at USC's Annenberg Center on Communication Leadership Policy. A former senior policy advisor to Vice President Al Gore, Morley was the director of the Initiative to Reinvent Government during the Clinton administration. He's the co-author of 3 books on millennials and generational change, coincidentally co-authored one of our other guests tonight. There is lots of ground to cover as we explore what makes 137 million young Americans tick. Some 45% of the voting population, still growing, is the subject of our discussion tonight. We'll examine why politicos of all stripes are watching them and their attitudes, and we'll hear why some are seeking to suppress the votes of these enormous generations, given their political inclinations. Let's get started. Morley, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, David. I always appreciate when people introduce me and tell them that I used to be in charge of reinventing the federal government. It's my biggest failure in life, but there you are. You can't change what happened. I am going to be moderating a discussion tonight on America's youngest voters, why they are catalysts for change and targets of suppression. And for that purpose, I have the great pleasure of introducing you to our two speakers tonight, who can tell you all you need to know about this subject. And if they don't, you can ask questions through the Q&A function later on. So Yael excuse me, after all that, I botched her name. Yael Bromberg is a constitutional rights attorney with 20 years of experience in community organizing, advocacy, and campaigns. She was formerly the general counsel for the voting rights at the Andrew Goodman Foundation, advancing the cause that foundation's namesake died for. Her groundbreaking insights on how to use the 26th Amendment to beat back unconstitutional attempts to impose restrictions on youth voting is just a leading example of her brilliant legal mind and activist orientation. And you'll see all that as she conducts and talks about this challenge in the course of tonight's program. On the other hand, I've known Mike Hais for more than 50 years. He's the smartest person I've ever known when it comes to extracting nuggets of wisdom from survey research data that can be put to practical and profitable use. The Disney Corporation, a bunch of Democratic candidates, and me personally, have used that talent to great advantage. And we remain close personal friends despite spending 10 of our 50 years co-authoring 3 books on the millennial generation and becoming the odd couple of book writing. I'm going to call on Mike here to begin the program, but let me just first show you, if Jeff can do that, a chart to clarify the names we're going to toss around tonight of generations and where they're at in the size and location of their age and sequence. The thing that David mentioned in terms of the 45% being under 40 is actually the over-under line of American voting today. We now have the largest generation gap between plurals and millennials, the younger generations, and the rest of the older generations shown on the right of your chart. And it is the largest generation gap since boomers came along. And you can all remember, don't trust anyone over 30 if you were of that age, and have some sense of how this is rattling its way through American society. You may also notice that we use the term plurals or the pluralist generation as opposed to the more commonly used Gen Z nomenclature, because Gen Z doesn't tell you anything about the generation. And it's time now to learn why we think the right name is pluralist generation. I'll turn this over to Mike Hais, my co-author and great friend.
Thank you, Morley. Put up slide 2, please.
Jeff?
Thank you. Plurals, as the heading says, are the first majority-minority generation in US history. If you look at the graph, you can see that the percentage of white people in the various generations has been cut in half from the oldest generation to the youngest generation. By contrast, the percentage of non-white people, particularly Hispanics and increasingly Asians, has more than doubled. And so this generation, the plurals, are now the first majority-minority generation in US history. And if current trends persist, by mid-century, the entire country is going to be majority-minority rather than one single majority group.
Mike, that shift from majority white, dominant white, to non-white is the cause of a lot of concern among a lot of people, not necessarily you and me, in America. But there's something else about the pluralist generation that I think you ought to just show our audience to underline some of the anxiety that's running through American politics today.
Okay, yes, thank you. Again, if you could put up chart 3, please. Plurals and millennials are the least religious and least Christian generations in US history. In the 1950s, over 90% of the population of the United States was Christian of one kind or another. About 2/3 were Protestant, and almost nobody was willing to say that they had no religious affiliation. increasingly, the number of Christians has declined. The number of Protestants, in particular, evangelical Protestants, has declined. And the number of people who identify with no religious tradition has more than doubled, actually quadrupled over the period of just these same generations. So what we have now seen is not only is demographically, ethnically, the country on the way to becoming a majority minority country, but the same thing is true of its religious affiliations, where the majority of people are very likely not to affiliate or identify with any of the major faith traditions. And you can understand that that is frightening to a fair number of people in this country. And it is one of the factors, a major factor, in fact, leading those people to want to suppress the votes of these youngest generations, to keep them out of the electorate as long as is possible.
Yael, do you find that kind of anxiety and fear when you do your work in sort of trying to beat back efforts to suppress the vote, or does it tend to fall into more parochial concerns? Yael, you are muted.
Sorry, I'm here. I
There you
think
go.
that to some extent, that anxiety and fear has always persisted when it comes to youth voters, because they're the unknown demographic. And so in 1971, when they finally won the franchise and were able to vote themselves after having led all pretty much of the movements of the day throughout the Second Reconstruction, that immediate decade after ratification of the 26th Amendment was actually met with vast voter suppression efforts against youth voters specifically. And so there's always this pushback against young voters because they're unknown. And just as Mike pointed out, they have always been independent, and they're increasingly independent. They eschew traditional party structures. They issue traditional institutional structures, be it party or religion or otherwise. Even if you talk to a millennial or pluralist today, they might have a very different perspective of what their job requirements would be and what institutionalization looks like in the workforce. And so this is a push. This is an example of how they've always been independent. And it's because of their independence, actually, that they were enfranchised. Young people have always led and helped create and write the story of America. Frederick Douglass, Alice Paul, Alexander Hamilton, the late, great John Lewis, they were all in their early 20s when they fought for the constitutionalization of new rights or the manifestation of rights already hard won and fought for. And they continue to do that today through their leadership. That's
not surprising to me, but for people who don't know you, extraordinarily insightful observations. I'm old enough to remember the Birch Bayh effort and the passage of Vote at 18, but it had a different slant. People were bipartisan support for that amendment. It passed in record time, if memory serves me correctly. Yet today, you see all of this work to try and suppress the vote. Have you been able, through your leadership and work with both the foundation and other constitutional scholars, found ways that use the constitutional protections of the 26th Amendment and or other things to beat back this effort?
Absolutely. I mean, the 26th Amendment is a part of the evolution of the right to vote jurisprudence. It is baked and a part of the 14th Amendment, the 15th Amendment, the 19th Amendment, et cetera. And it was introduced at the end of the Second Reconstruction because young people finally turned to themselves to enfranchise themselves. And just going back to the prior point, thank you for pointing that out, Morley. When the 26th Amendment was ratified, and for your listeners, I always have to take a pause and remind people what this amendment is, even those that were alive at the time. So the 26th Amendment was ratified in 1971. It lowered the voting age to 18, and it outlawed denial or abridgment of the right to vote on account of age. From that perspective, it's an age discrimination amendment related to access to the franchise. And as you note, Morley, huge cross-partisan support for enfranchising youth voters in 1971. It was President Eisenhower and Barry Goldwater who championed it among famous Democrats like Ted Kennedy. But it was also President Nixon who ceremoniously signed it into law. And I think that this notion of the independence is actually really important for us in terms of the conversation we're having today about why they serve such a critical role to democracy and how that was embraced across partisan lines. So when he ceremoniously signed the amendment into the law, President Nixon, of all people, he said that they infused the practice of democracy with, quote, some idealism, some courage, some stamina, some high moral purpose that this nation always needs, because a country throughout history we find goes through ebbs and flows of idealism. And going back to your question, Morley, the second part of your question is, yeah, we're seeing a flush of voter restrictions being introduced today, particularly in the wake of the 2020 election, and also in the wake of the 2008 election that we're still coming to terms with.
And those efforts, just to nail this down, and then we'll find out whether all your efforts are causing or enabling plurals to actually vote and how they might vote. But are your efforts, when you do all that work, do the local folks, the state legislatures, the county election officials, are they blatant about their desire to keep young people from voting? What kind of public explanation do they have for denying people their 26th Amendment rights?
Sometimes there's a lack of intentionality about it, but it's under the surface. So for example, the question about access to polling places on campuses where young people are centered, where they study, live, eat, sleep, etc. I did a survey of campuses from the 2018 election. Of the campuses I surveyed, less than half had a polling location on campus.
Yikes.
In Florida, as Chief Counsel for Voting Rights with the Andrew Goodman Foundation, where I continue to serve as Chief Counsel and Strategic Advisor, we fought against a law where the Secretary of State said that that campuses couldn't be hosts to early voting periods. They couldn't be hosts to early voting locations. And we quantified the impact of that morally, and it was really startling because when you say it generally, people say, okay. But those decisions actually have huge impact on the electoral margin and electoral outcome. So the 2018 election was the first election after we lifted that ban on the availability of early on-campus polling locations. In just 3 months, 12 campuses brought early polling locations on board. We got the preliminary injunction from the court in August 2018. Then that November was the general election. 60,000 voters availed themselves of that new electoral mechanism. And when you contrast that with the electoral margin that election, the Senate race in Florida in 2018, the margin was 10,000 voters and the gubernatorial was 32,000 voters. So just imagine if we could spread that across the state in terms of bringing polling places on campus. And there's a plethora of other types of special burdens that young voters specifically face as well, Morley, not just the polling place question.
It's great and unbelievable data. Mike, you're the data guy across the country, never mind just Florida. What indication do we have? We get that real live 2018 piece of experience. What kind of survey research data or voting data do we have to suggest that plurals are interested in voting and will vote if given the opportunity?
Well, specifically, what we have is that in 2018, actually, turnout was exceptionally high among young voters. It varies to some degree, but in the 2020 election in particular, young voters were highly crucial. Their turnout increased from about, almost doubled from about 19% to over 50% in 2020. So when given an
50%
opportunity,
of the eligible, right?
Pardon me?
50% of the eligible voter, right? Of those eligible
young voters
yeah.
voted in that election in 2020. It increased markedly over 2016. And there were a number of reasons for that. One of them is there were obviously concerns about the the candidates, particularly Donald Trump, on either the positive or the negative side, young voters were very concerned. But also, I think it's important to note that many opportunities because of COVID were given for people to vote and have opportunities to vote early through mail and a variety of ways. And young voters took advantage of that opportunity. And they were crucial in the election. In a number of states, in fact, key states like Pennsylvania, Arizona, Georgia, it's very likely that young voters, particularly young voters of color, probably were the deciding factor in Joe Biden carrying those states. So when given an opportunity, young voters will turn out to vote in large numbers.
So that begs the question, and we'll need a couple more of your great charts to get into the detail. How do they vote when they vote? You've already said they were a critical edge in the 2020 election. And you got national numbers, charts to back that up?
I certainly do. And if you could put up, please, chart 4. Thank you. One of the reasons it's very interesting that the 1971 year when the 26th Amendment was passed came at an interesting time. First of all, it was during the Vietnam War, and people felt it was only fair that if people were eligible for the draft and eligible to go overseas and take a chance on being killed, they should have an opportunity to vote. But also, it was a period of bipartisan cooperation, much more so than you see at the present time. And if you look at the one generation, the baby boomer generation, in spite of the image that it was a radical generation, actually baby boomers were fairly evenly divided between Republicans and Democrats. What's happened currently, if you look at the chart, is that there are now about almost twice as many Democrats as there are Republicans among the two youngest generations. And I think that is one factor that contributes to a desire, perhaps, to limit the votes of younger people, because there is a partisan implication to the vote and voting for those two younger generations.
Did they come
you can
to
also
that?
find the same thing is true of their ideological beliefs.
Yeah,
Young voters.
I was going to ask you, Mike, did they come to that partisan decision out of loyalty to a party or from ideology? And what is their ideology?
Well, they come to the decision for a variety of reasons. One of them is, in fact, to some degree, loyalty to a party, not necessarily as an institution, but as a voting queue. Young voters identify with like everybody else, with the political party, and that helps them to interpret the world of politics. And so young voters come to decisions about, as they view the world, as to which party they will identify with. And depending on the era in which they are coming of age, they will identify either as Republicans or Democrats, not entirely. That isn't a commitment to vote for the Democratic or Republican Party, but they tend to vote in that direction. And once those attitudes are established, they tend to stick with those attitudes for the course of their lives. And it also affects their beliefs on issues and their ideology as well.
So are they a bunch of leftists that will never be able to unite with the older folks in the Democratic Party? Do you have a chart on that?
Well, there is a chart 5. If you look at the ideological beliefs, you can see that the percentage of conservatives, that's the red, has gone down from one generation, the oldest generation, to the youngest by more than half. And on the other hand, the number of people who identify in the youngest generations as liberals or progressives has more than doubled. And what we are coming to right now is that for the first time, probably since the GI or greatest generation of World War II, the first time when there are actually at least as many, if not more, liberal identifiers than conservative identifiers. And that has not existed since really that generation that came of age during the Great Depression and World War II.
So at the risk of leave the slide up if you could for a minute, Jeff. At the risk of having people's eyes get a little unfocused with all the numbers, it's really important that people look at this chart as you try and figure out why the Democratic Party has such difficulty uniting. You have pointed out that how much more left, if you will, plurals and millennials are. I mentioned that the 40%, the age 40 is now the over and under mark for how people vote. It's what the votes of, sorry to tell it, most people on this call, it's the votes of people under 40 that are giving the Democrats their margin of victory. But just think about the challenge of uniting that ideological split across the generations. Okay, back
Not
to
only-
Mike and not
only that, Morley, but the Republican identifiers are ideologically very united. About 80% of them or more call themselves conservative. The Democratic identifiers are much more divided. The largest number are liberals, but about a third are moderates, and even 10 or 15% are conservatives. So it's very difficult to unite the Democrats, as you say.
Is that, and Yael, I want you to join in here based upon the work that you've done on behalf of this generation and with this generation. The reason that people are gathering every Wednesday night to listen to this wonderful program is because of our concern about the future of democracy and whether it will survive in our lifetimes, regardless of how old we might be. Besides the ideology of that young generation and younger generations, should we also be concerned about their attitudes towards democracy? Obviously, you've done a lot of work in getting them out to vote or enabling them to get out to vote, and some activism as well. But is democracy in bad shape with the young generation?
My experience is that, so I work with young people who are activists, who are organizers, and who are interested in changing state laws and working with their college campuses and local and state and national officials, and will litigate when necessary to overturn bad laws. And my experience with them is that they're actually incredibly engaged, they're incredibly interested, and that there's a lot of beautiful empowerment that can take and impact that can take place with just a simple flush of the right type of support, be it strategic support or resource or whatnot. I can't tell you how many times I talk to young people who, this sounds extreme, but it's true. They tell me that they were in near tears because they were fighting against something so much. And I spoke with them, and just through like a simple conversation with somebody who understands where they are, can offer some strategic support, including a legal lens to their work and a constitutional framework, we find a way for them to overcome whatever barrier they have. And what I find from that is that they're incredibly engaged and they're incredibly smart. The Florida case that I mentioned before, the reason that it came about was because a young physics student wrote an op-ed in a statewide paper and said, this is just plainly wrong. And we see that. We see young people are leading all of the movements of today, if it's gun control or climate change, social justice, racial justice, et cetera. And they always have, and they always will. And it's a question of whether or not we can support them and get out of their way, quite frankly. Young people, they're interested. They're taking up increasingly a larger and larger pool of the voting population. And both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party would be good to listen to them and to actually respond to what their needs are. Just as Mike said earlier, the 2020 election, we saw the largest voter turnout overall in the 21st century. It's the first election in which young people under 30, the majority of them came out and voted. And there's two reasons for that. And Mike said them perfectly before. One was they were fighting against authoritarianism and for democracy. It was not a question of partisanship this election. It was about voting for the basic principle of democracy, which we're continuing to fight for. And the second piece was the election modernization trends that were temporarily ushered in as a result of the pandemic. The uniform distribution in some states of vote by mail ballots, led to increased participation of young people. 57% largest statewide turnouts by young people were in states that allowed for these kind of universal common sense policies. But this is where I can't just hang my hat and criticize the Republican Party only, because we need more leadership from the Democrats. We have Joe Manchin, who sat in the way, issuing the call of his West Virginia predecessor, Senator Jennings Randolph, who was the grandfather of the 26th Amendment, had introduced it over 3 decades, 30 years, over 150 times in the legislature to usher it through. And meanwhile, Joe Manchin has sat in the way of voting rights. Now, the voting rights bill, the 2 voting rights bills are finally on their way they've passed the House, they're on their way to the Senate, along with other critical federal reforms that continue to hang in the balance. And still the Democrats, I think, would do well to listen to these calls. I'll give you one example. I have litigated now twice successfully on behalf of Bard College to implement a polling place on campus in the blue state of New York, okay? In New York, there's been a bill, long languishing, which would place polling places on requisite campuses that meet the minimum criteria for it. Long languishing bill. In the blue state of New Jersey, where the progressive governor was, I think there was a recent article that said he's the most progressive governor in the nation. Also, a long languishing bill for election day registration. And we know that those critical reforms are the ones that are the quickest to be slashed. In North Carolina, they slashed election day registration. The Fourth Circuit said overturns the omnibus law there that had been ratified, that had passed, saying that it was implemented with almost surgical precision to suppress the vote of African Americans. But what's really interesting when you look at the youth piece of it, that election day registration slash was hugely influential for youth voters specifically, who relied on it at outsized rates, just like they rely on early voting at outsized rates. So I also look at, for example, what the policies that are being put in the blue states. And one quick other last example is the availability of pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, particularly where it's coupled with a robust civics curriculum. In North Carolina, where the omnibus law was slashed, was eventually found to be unconstitutional by the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. There they slashed a pre-registration program that in just 3 years had registered 160,000 16 and 17-year-olds. And they did it through a really innovative program that brought county registrars into the high schools to do voter education that was basically married with the civics curriculum. And so do we have robust pre-registration in the blue states? I mean, we have to look for youth empowerment across and through partisan lines, which is in keeping with the history of the amendment, which had massive cross-partisan and uniform appeal.
Great stuff there. And I just wanted to add, California introduced online registration and saw an explosion of Democratic vote as a result of that. So I want to, the examples are terrific. I want to make sure that we're not extrapolating small pieces into large truths. Mike, how true is all of the stuff that Yael just talked about in terms of getting response and seeing the reaction of young people and their belief in democracy in action?
Well, first of all, young people do believe in democracy. That's very clear. About 2/3 of them say that democracy is very important, and another chunk believes that it's at least somewhat important that the United States persist as a democracy. Virtually no young people are willing to give up on democracy. They recognize, like everybody else does, that democracy has challenges, but they also think it is very important to preserve the system. And they're willing to take the steps to do that. Not only voting, we've been talking about voting, and that is obviously a key thing, but the activities beyond voting, the more difficult activities, young people have been very active in participating in. They have close to 30%, for example, have joined organizations that deal with civic issues. A quarter have contributed money. And these are young people just getting started who may not have as much money to contribute to political or social causes, but they've been willing to do that. So they have been extremely active and participants in democracy. I'd also like to add one other thing. One of the things that I find encouraging, particularly about plurals, but millennials to some degree as well, is their willingness to compromise across party lines, which you don't see, unfortunately, from the older generations to quite the same degree. Younger Republican plurals, for example, are actually closer to their Democratic co-generationists, if that's a word I can use, on a variety of issues like race relations, like gay rights, like climate change, than they are to the older Republicans. When we get to the point where those generations are actually running things in government, I think we are going to see a return to the kind of bipartisan compromise that was a function in the past in the United States. And I think it's going to be younger people and their activities that are going to be able to bring a lot of this about.
Well, that's a very hopeful note. Yael, are there places or people or organizations rather that people who are now agitated by our conversation and want to do something about this issue could turn to or help, whether they're young or not?
Well, we're fortunate in this country that we do have robust, good government organizations that are doing wonderful democracy work in general. The ones that are doing really unique work in the youth voting space, I have to plug and share my organization, the Andrew Goodman Foundation. We're on 100 campuses in 24 states and the District of Columbia and growing, particularly unique portfolio from that regard. We work with young people and colleges to make young voices a powerful force in democracy. Also, there's a really great organization that's based in California. I know that you have a lot of California listeners tuning in, called the Civic Center, based in LA, that focuses on the pre-registration piece. They work exclusively with high schoolers to register them to vote, primarily in California. They've done some really great reports and research. So that's another avenue for supporting folks that are in the field, one for high schoolers, the other one for College Plus.
That's very helpful. We're going to turn now to some audience questions so we get some answers for some of the folks out there in the viewing audience. But before we do that, I do want to underline not only Mike's point about the opportunity for cooperation within the age group remains high. I know, Yael, you found the same situation in some of the work that you've done. And I also am heartened by the notion that they're interested in participation in democracy, put their money where their mouth is, or more accurately, put their feet in action where their mouth is on that topic. That gives us all, I think, some reason to be optimistic about the future. Okay, with regard to questions, they've been coming in through our Q&A function, and I will obviously not get to all of them. There's one that we have to get out of the way, even though I'm not supposed to answer questions, because somebody asked, don't younger, more liberal voters become more conservative as they age? I can understand why the question was asked. I just want to take the opportunity to say that is completely false. It has not been shown in any survey research data. People adhere to the voting patterns, as Mike indicated earlier, that they take up in their young age. But there is a specific. Okay, go ahead.
I give one example that we've used before.
Well, very quickly.
It goes back a bit, but in the 2004 election, there were two generational groups that voted for John Kerry, the Democratic candidate. And that was the very first millennials coming into the electorate and the very last GIs, or greatest generation, leaving the electorate. And that GI generation, by that point, those were people in their 80s and 90s, and yet they were still as democratic as they ever were when they voted for Franklin Roosevelt back in the 1930s and 40s.
Okay. Yael, there's a question here specifically for you. I'll give you a chance to answer it. Is the U.S. Justice Department investigating the efforts to suppress the younger voters in Florida?
Well, in Florida, we overturned the ban through 26th Amendment, precedential 26th Amendment litigation. But there is ongoing 26th Amendment litigation still, one out of Texas, and there are various efforts. I mean, I just really scratched the surface on the types of special burdens that young voters face. Student identification cards are not ubiquitously offered as a form of voter identification. Oftentimes, the right to vote from campus is, there's a lot of misinformation, but the Supreme Court upheld it in the only summary judgment decision in 1979 that it heard on the 26th Amendment. And the list goes on and on. So the one thing that I want to help to get to as a takeaway, Morley, is that, you know, a lot of people have forgotten what the 26th Amendment is, but we're in the midst of celebrating its 50th anniversary. And so the more that we can discuss it and remember what its promises and engage in popular education, the more people will start to view these individual infringements as a part of a systemic issue. And actually, going back to the question, the 26th Amendment allows for the Attorney General to institute lawsuits against malfeasance as well, but also private rights of action on behalf of youth voters.
Mike, we've got a question that your work experience and your doctoral learning is perfect for answering. We've cited a lot of survey research on this program. There's more for those willing to delve into it to be found out there in the world and in our writings. But is there a specific challenge? Is there a good representation or not in pollsters talking to young people? How leery are they? How accurate and valid are the results from things like the Harvard poll on 18 to 29-year-olds?
Well, I don't want to get into a long methodological discussion here, but polling actually is quite accurate. There are challenges in certain races, but I would trust that the Harvard poll, and particularly even more so, the Pew surveys that are conducted periodically about American generations are extremely accurate and able to fathom really how the various generations, their political attitudes and their attitudes in a variety of ways. And I would just recommend to any of the listeners who are interested in delving further into this to look at the Pew Research website, and you can find all sorts of information on the attitudes of and behavior of younger people, really people of all ages, but particularly younger voters. Pew has been very focused on that.
And another question related to that from the viewers: does that Pew Research and/or your examination of voting data suggest that there is a difference in voting patterns among young people by race or ethnicity and/or ethnicity?
Yes, of course. Just as everything, in some ways, is sadly, I suppose, things are often divided in this country along racial and ethnic lines. But even among young people, the same divisions that you see, white young people are more likely to be Republican than young people of color, although white young people are more Democratic than older white people are. But there are the same divisions that you see for the population in general.
Are they as stark as the older generation?
I'm sorry?
Are the differences as stark as they are in older generations?
No, they are not as stark as they are, primarily because white young voters, white millennials, white plurals, are much more evenly divided between the parties than are older white members of older white generations.
So, Yael, we now need to go back into some of the detail of how this voter suppression happens. One person asked, are Republicans, this is a little bit of a trick question for you, are Republicans also denying students the opportunity to vote using their campus address?
Yes.
Aha, but is it only Republicans?
Oh, was it? Well, you know, we have some examples like in New Hampshire, for example, Republican state, constant harassment and litigation related to young people, forcing them to have to prove their permanent allegiance to a college, for example, by, for example, offering a copy of their voter registration license card, voter registration card as proof of ongoing citizenship to the locality. But this question is generally applied across board. I mean, people in general, I think Democrats included, they think that young people are the upset, the independent swing, the group that they can't always rely on for
The disruptors.
The disruptors. You know, they're not on the voter rolls. They don't have necessarily the polling. They don't know who their list is for voter turnout in the same way as they have on their readily available lists from prior cycles, et cetera. And so this is something that, you know, I don't want to just I have a lot to credit the Democratic Party, but a lot of these conversations tend to be just focused on one on the other. And I think that we obviously have to focus on voter suppression. 19 states have ushered in 34 voter restrictions in just since the January 6th insurrection just a year ago. We can't forget that. We can't forget the federal legislation that's pending. But when we look at youth voters, I'm very interested also in studying expansion opportunities. And that applies across partisan lines. And whether or not it's intentional or not intentional is a different question. But there is opportunity across partisan line here for growth.
One of the challenges, I think, is that Democrats don't quite realize the potential of young voters to the extent that they should. They don't recognize there's this argument whether we should go for young voters, older voters, and I don't think Democrats in office and in the party often fully recognize the power of this generation that is coming their way.
I think that's
right. And I
absolutely
think
true.
there's a bit of trepidation about it. For example, why is it that in even blue states, they can't have an on-campus polling location or election day registration?
By the way, we have a question on that on-campus stuff, polling place. Is there a threshold minimum of students to get one, or does it vary by state law or local practice?
Well, there's very limited state legislation that has been proposed around what would be a requisite threshold for requiring a university to put a polling place on campus. So these are new proposals. There's one in New York, there's one in Maryland, there's one other state is currently escaping me. But these are very new proposals that are being discussed. I'm told that the New York Youth Voting Coalition has really rallied around this new proposal, long pending proposal, but they're rallying around it for 2022 to be one of their main points of issue. So, you know, there's room for potential across the board. The institutions of higher education have a role here as civic and democracy partners. You know, they're required to engage in voter registration through federal mandate. And there are a range of opportunities here for further mandating of youth engagement, but also just encouragement.
So there's one classic question I'll save just for a moment. But we have one more related question to the stuff we're just talking about that I want to get in. It's the issue of voter fraud because of the transitory nature of youth who are moving in from home to college campus, for those fortunate enough to be able to afford to go to college, et cetera, and get starting work. Even though voter fraud is overall a red herring piece of the conversation about voting rights, is there any indication that young people have engaged in any kind of fraudulent behavior when the opportunity to vote is made easier for them?
Absolutely not. Voter fraud, you're more likely to be hit by lightning than to have an example of in-person voter impersonation. That is a myth that's been propagated by the help of nefarious agencies and actors that traffic in fear and lies and disinformation. Voter fraud is not something that we should be focused on. When we are overly focused on voter fraud, this is where we allow the narrative to be flipped, right? What does election integrity and public confidence in our elections mean? It means participation. It doesn't mean restricting the gate of who can engage and trying to change the rules in order to jerry-rig the outcome. That is not what a public confidence in our electoral systems looks like. And it doesn't appear for youth voters any more or less or at all as compared to other age cohorts. And in fact, that was a question that came up during the 1979 26th Amendment case that went up to the United States Supreme Court. And the court basically upheld a lower decision that found that you can't selectively presume that youth voters are eligible or not eligible to vote compared to other populations. That's a violation of equal protection, and it's a violation of the 26th Amendment. You can't pose new questions or special obstacles or special burdens on youth voters that you don't apply or expect on other voters. And yet, 7 states in the country only allow for access to no excuse to vote by mail to those 60 or 65 plus, and not to those who are 55 years old, and not to those who are 18 years old, even in the midst of the election, and even if they're immunocompromised. And we have a lot of examples in 2020 where we've had robust election modernization. And what we need to do is to look at those examples and to use them as an opportunity for hope, to say that participation encourages public confidence, and that is what election integrity actually is.
Okay, on that note, which I love, the one question we have that kind of sums up all of this is, what is the best strategy for getting young people, plurals and millennials out to vote? I'm going to do a quick note of personal privilege. One of the best strategies would be to connect to an outfit called RISE, R-I-S-E, which is the leading student advocacy and for voting rights organization in the country for students to get involved. And their methodology is to have students talk to other students to get them out to vote. But there's a second equally good thing, which is to hire Yael to break up the legal barriers that might stand in the way of your particular campaign. And third, talk to Mike about the issues that will motivate voters. Are they pro-life? Are they not? What are the issues motivating young people to come out and vote? And is democracy one of them? Mike?
Well, I think democracy is one of them, but probably the key issues that young people are concerned about, one of them is clearly climate change. It's their generations that are going to be living in this world as the climate does change, and so they are particularly concerned about that. They are also concerned about human rights of all sorts, racial, ethnic, gay rights, and so on. And those are the issues that I think really speak to those 2 generations. And obviously as well, their place in this society and the economy. Of course, they've got to be concerned about that. But I would say those 3 issues, climate change, human rights, and the economy, are issues that particularly motivate those younger 2 generations.
It used to be healthcare until everybody got the right to stay on their parents' insurance under the.
That I think is more people in our generation.
Yeah, until they were 26.
At some point, God willing, they'll be concerned about healthcare. But right now, it's the other issues that I think are more crucial.
Terrific. Listen, do you think that, last question, and then we'll have a chance to summarize here. We're only got 5 minutes left. Do you think that the current Supreme Court will take the same attitudes towards the 26th Amendment and its prohibition on abridging based on age the right to vote as the past precedents that you're citing?
You know, I can't make predictions about the current United States Supreme Court, to be honest with you, particularly as I followed the oral argument related to the question of women's rights to bodily autonomy, and the commitment or disregard for precedent within those circumstances. There is good Supreme Court precedent that upholds the 26th Amendment. The jurisprudence immediately following its ratification applied strict scrutiny to challenges and tossed them out. That's the highest standard of judicial review available, where the state actually has to have a valid, justifiable excuse for imposing a remedy. And so the question remains whether or not the Supreme Court and the federal judiciary will continue to follow that, especially because the judiciary, unfortunately, particularly in certain circuits, has become increasingly polarized. Meanwhile, we still have the state courts, and we still have local remedies such as the polling place question, which is a purely local question. So we have to make inroads on the federal level, of course. The independence of our judiciary is critical at the moment. I'm happy to see the new appointments that have been coming in, but we can't forget the premise of state constitutional rights and the strength of state constitutional rights, including around the right to vote, and look for other proactive solutions that look at, for example, local remedies. And going to your question before, Morley, what can people do? I think we have to support organizers, and we have to support a policy and approach to social change that leverages organizing, advocacy, public education, and litigation when necessary. I think that there are different social justice organizations in the space, and everyone has carved out their own niche, and that's really good. But really, when you do it through coalition work or otherwise, and you are able to integrate those various strategies, that's where I think that you reach a tipping point. And I find a lot of hope in the question about youth voting. And this is a good way to kind of end out the comments on my end, is that youth voters are independent, they're cross-partisan. My experience is Republicans don't want to hear about youth voter suppression for their students any more than Democratic parents do. And age, unlike other constitutional classifications like race or national origin, is really unique. It's a classification that is fixed, meaning you can't change it, despite some people's best efforts. You can't change your age. It's universal, meaning everybody ages out. We're all young once, and God willing, we continue to age. And it's something that we can all unite and experience together, and we all remember it. So from that perspective, I think that my hope is that the question about protecting against age-based discrimination and access to the franchise can actually be a unifying force. And that again goes to recall the history of the 26th Amendment and its nearly universal appeal and support by across partisan lines.
Perfect for closing remarks from you. Mike, you got one final thought or a big thought that you want to express that you haven't?
Yes, I would certainly do. As we've seen, the United States really over the past 4 or 5 decades has changed from, and is being driven by younger generations, by the 2 younger generations, from a country that was almost entirely white and almost entirely Christian to one that is majority minority in both its race and ethnicity and its religion. That has had an impact on the partisanship, potential partisanship of the country going forward. It's something that I think does terrify Republicans going forward, and it's something that many Democrats don't recognize. It's something that has led or has the potential to lead to voter suppression, or at least unwillingness to eliminate voter suppression in both directions.
Thank you both for all of your wonderful comments, insights, and learning that you've been willing to share with us tonight. Also, obviously, want to thank the audience above all for tuning in and viewing this conversation. The conversation will continue, not next week, but the week after on January 5th. And on January 5th, we have this dynamite program. It is the eve of the 1-year anniversary of the January 6th insurrection. We will be learning from people involved in that discussion and watching the critical work of the committee, the House Select Committee, bipartisan committee on the insurrection, what is likely to become one of the dominant stories of the 2022 election year, and hopefully educate people on the dangers facing our democracy. On behalf of everybody involved in these programs, I'd like to wish you all good health, safety, obviously, in the new year. Have as happy a holiday as you can under the circumstances that we live in. Good night.